Hi everyone, my name is Kailey.
And my name is Heidi. We are students from UMass Boston creating this podcast as a project for our Radical Voices of Resistance course. We are calling it the Badass Women Podcast, and the goal of this project is to create an episode informing all of you guys listening about one of the female activists we learned about this semester. In this episode, we will be discussing one influential woman in history who has done so much activist work throughout her life, and her name is Harriet Tubman.
We chose Harriet Tubman as our topic for today because we wanted to go into a deep dive and talk about all of the amazing work she did from when she was very young to the very end of her life. If you don't already know, she was an enslaved woman, most famously known for her role in civil rights, women's rights, and the Underground Railroad. But that is only scratching the surface, as she did so much more as well. So throughout this episode, we hope to share with you her significant impacts and as much of her story accurately in the short time we have.
Let's start from the beginning. Somewhere between 1820 to 1822, Harriet Tubman was born in Dorchester County, Maryland. When exactly she was born is not certain. However, most historians agree on very early 1820s. She died in Auburn, New York on March 10, 1913. She lived a long and very fulfilling life. She was born into slavery and later in life managed to escape and live the rest of her life as a free woman. However, there will be much more on that later. Harriet Tubman was enslaved from birth along with her 8 other siblings. Her parents were Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green. While her father was a free man, her mother was not free. She was still enslaved, which meant any children she had would be enslaved as well, even if the father wasn't. It didn't matter due to chattel slavery, so her mother was unfortunately still considered someone else's property. However, this, in reference to the state of her mother's freedom, is later discovered as untrue due to a technicality. Back to her early life, you may have noticed that Harriet's mother shares the same name as her. Well, that would actually be the other way around. Basically, when she was born, Harriet was named Araminta. She also went by Minty, but then she changed her name to Harriet as a young adult when she got married. It was likely that she named herself after her mother. Growing up, Harriet despised slavery life. Edward Brodess separated her family and kept them from gathering together so he would divide them through different types of work. They would either be sold or rented, and their work schedule often varied, as they worked for very long periods. This meant that they had less of a chance at seeing each other. And of course, their earnings would go to Brodess. Harriet was not an exception, as she worked for him up until her escape. At age 5 or 6, Harriet was rented to do housework and childcare. However, she was not fond of house chores and would often get abused or beaten due to her refusal to cooperate. She would then get sent to do field work, which she much preferred.
But that did not mean that she enjoyed her life the way it was. It was obviously very uncomfortable and cruel, and it wasn't difficult to recognize this racial injustice that was occurring during the time. This life was not normal nor sustainable, which Harriet knew from the very beginning. It was the working conditions, the pain and anguish from being separated from her family, and just slavery in general. Harriet loathed this life and longed for some semblance of autonomy, and could no longer bear this torture. She experienced what I would consider a turning point at a very young age, as her focus from working would shift over to the pursuit of freedom. Of course, throughout her life, there were many factors that would lead her to this standpoint, but I think in this instance that I'm about to talk about in particular, just gave her a sense of clarity. So, at age 13, Harriet was sent out to run an errand and witnessed another slave leave his work without permission, and she entered a local supply store. There, she would see an overseer and ordered Harriet and others to help tie him up for a whipping. She refused. The slave ran away, and in desperation, the overseer flung a weight, which was meant to target the runaway, but instead ended up hitting her in the head, which left her with a fractured skull and a concussion she never fully recovered from. So she would live with this concussion for basically the rest of her life. Upon her injury, she was rushed to the house, bleeding and fainting. No one thought she would even live, which is possibly why she wasn't given any proper care. They just believed that she would be replaceable and just didn't really bother helping her recover. It was so bad that she couldn't recognize anyone and was said to be delirious for 2 months. So as a result of this, Throughout her life, she experienced seizures and quote-unquote sleeping spells, which historians have now realized may have been narcolepsy. If you don't already know, narcolepsy is a neurological and sleeping disorder where the person struggles to remain awake throughout the day due to immense drowsiness. It is incredibly disruptive, as it is common for those suffering with this disorder to sleep randomly during the day, multiple times a day. This can be dangerous if left untreated, as it affects motor functions, causes sleep attacks in the middle of the day, and causes hallucinations, which Harriet was theorized to have. She recounted having visions of Christ, which motivated her in helping her escape. Later in life, she had an operation at MGH in Boston to relieve the pressure on her head. So I actually didn't know about this information until very recently, which personally I feel like I have been, for lack of a better word, robbed of this information, just because I feel like this is so crucial to her life. I mean, it is a disability, which I'm really surprised that no one has ever talked about this. Like, I was never taught this in school. But unfortunately, many historians neglect this part of her identity. But in my opinion, I think her disability is a very important part of who she is, and I think more people should be aware of this piece of information because it shows that she was clearly more than just her disability, as well as just shows that she was capable of doing so much more despite it. Obviously, she is recognized for her involvement in civil rights and even leading many people to freedom. Obviously, that is very honorable and worth teaching others about, but I think including her disability just adds another layer to her amazing story, as well as just proves how competent she was. And I think people should know the full truth. As for familial relations, they were obviously very important for Harriet, but they also played a huge role in Harriet's escape to freedom, so I will be explaining this right now. So subsequently after her injury, Harriet was forced to work. She said, quote, "There I worked with blood and sweat rolling down my face till I couldn't see," end quote. It was in this moment where Harriet realized the weight of this injustice and how much they did not care for her at all. So she needed to find some autonomy. Sometime after her injury, through negotiations, she persuaded her master into letting her choose her own work tasks. He would only permit this as long as she would give him her wages, which she honestly did not mind because she was not getting paid well either way. So she decided to use this as an opportunity and take advantage to explore and get familiar with the landscaping and geography of the area. So on one of her work days, she was able to work with her father and spend time with him after years of being separated. This actually came as a surprise to both of them, but it was pleasant nonetheless. She was also able to work with sailors who shared their knowledge of the area, which also helped aid in giving Harriet skills on navigation. She would also then meet her first husband, John Tubman, and get married with him in 1844, where she was said to be in her early 20s. It would also be here that she officially changed her name to Harriet. Around 1849, Brodus, her slave master, went into debt and would eventually need to sell his slaves. This meant Harriet would be separated from her family, which is something she did not want. In the same year, Brodus would die, and his death would drive her into trying to seek freedom because him dying would mean all of them would get separated anyway. So Harriet needed a plan. She had thought out every detail basically of her freedom, and she knew she needed to go to Philadelphia as the abolitionist movement was occurring there, and there were many supporters. She developed a route using her knowledge of geography and convinced her two brothers into going with her to all get free together. Unfortunately, though, they were alerted by an ad that demanded their return, and the two brothers returned back to Dorchester County as they didn't want to risk it, and they just did not want to get caught and face those consequences. However, Harriet did not go with them. She found courage in her visions, and she went on to Pennsylvania by herself, using the stars. So, in regards to everything that had led up to this moment, I believe it's important to note that Harriet essentially did not receive any help the first time she escaped. Driven by the idea of finally being free, she did not let even her brothers caving in and returning to stop her. It was interesting to see that despite everything she had been through, she was never discouraged. She never faltered, she didn't let low morale get to her, and she essentially persevered all by herself. Even before the events leading up to her escape, in the same year she got married. she had found out that her mother was technically a free woman, as Harriet contacted a lawyer to dig into her legal history. The lawyer would uncover that due to the death of a previous enslaver, her mother would have been a free woman, which, if you remember, since Harriet's father was also a free man, this would mean their children would be free as well. This was incredibly life-changing information to hear. I mean, Harriet would have lived a completely different life, devoid of having her rights and autonomy stripped away. She would have stayed with her family, she would have never had that injury for the rest of her life, and most importantly, she would have belonged to only herself. It was no surprise that Harriet wanted to take this to the courts because this would mean she legally wasn't a slave anymore, or at all even. She had been living this lie her entire life, and she would seriously do anything just to be free. This information was almost enough to prove her freedom. Unfortunately, however, her lawyer discouraged her from pursuing this lawsuit because they believed not a single court would hear her case. And even if they did, they wouldn't care that much to amend things. Upon hearing this information, Harriet was rightfully distraught. Her life and the life of her siblings were robbed. These were years she was never going to get back. However, she agreed and dropped the case, but that did not stop her from resenting her situation. In fact, it fueled her hatred even more, knowing that there wasn't any justice for a person of her skin color, that the government does not care about her rights or her opinions, especially as a black woman. It was very eye-opening for her and pushed her even more to distrust and disobey authority. So, in 1849, because of the death of her enslaver, it was almost certain Harriet would be separated from her family. She heard that her brothers would be sold and was of course miserable about this information, as she obviously did not want all of that. On top of that, her husband John Tubman threatened to sell her as well, which I also found absurd. I mean, it was her own husband threatening to sell her, so she knew she needed to leave. So all of this would push her into planning out her escape, as well as also be when she attempted to escape with her brothers for the very first time. So as you remember from earlier, I mentioned that her brothers turned back because they were afraid of the consequences of getting caught mid-escape. They thought it would be greater than just turning themselves in, so they went back. Of course, this was devastating for Harriet because this would mean that she wouldn't be able to be free with her brothers, but she couldn't turn back now, especially because of everything she was going through at the time. She was determined to see through her freedom. I mean, it was everything she was dreaming about since basically forever. So she continued on by herself, the threat of being caught always looming above her head, but never discouraging her. She couldn't afford to be scared even though she was on the run, and basically everyone and everything was a threat to her. Her freedom meant so much more to her. All she had were the stars, her intelligence, and her determination. Sure enough, Harriet was able to successfully escape to Philadelphia, and there she would stay for a full year as a free woman. It turns out she was fully capable of doing this all by herself. She would then outdo herself because later, as for her second attempt, she would return to Maryland to free her sister and her family. She was able to free them all without any complications whatsoever. She was determined no lives would be taken under her leadership. This would only be the beginning of Harriet's story.
One of Harriet Tubman's significant impacts is her work on the Underground Railroad. To introduce the topic of the Underground Railroad, we first want to play a quick clip that describes what we first thought it was when we heard about it as kids. This clip is from the Underground Railroad Crash Course on YouTube.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. If you're like me, when you first heard of this thing called the Underground Railroad as a kid, you imagined a vast network of steam engines that crisscrossed the southern United States in dark tunnels surrounded by soil and rock. These trains, I thought, carried enslaved people from the violence of their plantations to the freedom of northern cities. I imagined it kind of like the subway system of New York City, except with a lot less rats. Some writers, like the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Colson Whitehead, have even imagined this real-life train system in their stories, depicting the Underground Railroad as something that traversed across the South, making stops in each state to collect enslaved people who had escaped and were trying to make their way to freedom. But the reality is, despite what third-grade Clint thought, the Underground Railroad wasn't an actual railroad. It was, in fact, something even more remarkable. It was a group of people who used their homes, their heads, and their hearts to secretly help enslaved people make their way out of the South and toward what they hoped would be a better future. These were people, black and white alike, who often risked everything to help people they didn't even know. But they helped them because they knew that slavery was wrong, and they wanted to play whatever small role they could in helping as many people as possible reach freedom. The Underground Railroad is an incredible part of American history, and it is also something that has been mythologized in ways that aren't always accurate. But today, we're going to separate fact from fiction. Let's get started.
So what is the Underground Railroad? In a nutshell, the Underground Railroad was a network of people that connected and spanned from the south to the north of the United States. The people involved helped provide food and shelter for runaway slaves to help them fully escape and become free in the north. Harriet Tubman played a significant part on the Underground Railroad. She worked as a conductor and freed around 70 people using the Underground Railroad.
Tubman was what was known as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. A conductor was someone who helped lead other slaves to freedom. Some of the people she led were family members, such as her niece. She also had tried to get her first husband, John, to head north, but he had remarried and chosen to stay in Maryland. The 1850 Slave Act made this work as a conductor more dangerous. This law allowed for the capture and return of runaway slaves, so she started to carry a pistol for protection and to encourage people who thought about turning around from escape. In addition to being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman also held many other roles, such as a general, scout, nurse, and spy for the Union Army. She actually ended up leading the Combahee Ferry Raid. In June of 1863, Harriet led 150 black Union soldiers up the Combahee River. Their aim was to free enslaved people and destroy several influential plantations. Many of the slaves were frightened, but she managed to convince them to come aboard to freedom. Raids like this were devastating to white Southerners, according to Judith Nees. This is because it emphasized their vulnerability to Union forces, even in the Deep South. In addition to this, another significant impact of Harriet Tubman was that she participated and was active in many different movements. While she is most notable for her role in civil rights, she was also very active in women's rights movements. As a suffragist, she even spoke at some events. Sometimes she would also experience a sleeping spell from her disability, but then would wake up and give her speech. In addition, she also worked alongside many famous suffragists, such as Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Her work as a suffragist was amazing. After the Civil War ended, Harriet Tubman was never given a pension for her work in the Union. As said in our book, 9 Women by Judith Nees, she received very little credit and no compensation. In 1864, she requested a leave of absence from the Union Army and returned to New York. She then became the sole support of her parents and married Nelson Davis, a black soldier she met in the South. When he passed away, the U.S. Congress finally succumbed to pressure from the public and awarded her a pension. However, the fact that they awarded it to Mrs. Nelson Davis hinted at her status as a widow of a soldier, therefore never truly recognizing her work as Harriet Tubman. Near the end of her life, Harriet Tubman created the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigent Negroes in Auburn, New York. According to the National Park Service, she had cared for her elderly parents and wanted to continue helping her community in other ways. So, at the age of 74, she purchased some land near her residence to turn into a facility for elders in her community. After being unable to raise the funds to open it, she partnered with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. She deeded the property to the church in exchange for them opening and operating the facility. The Tubman House had operated from 1908 until the early 1920s. After its closure, many buildings fell apart, but the church decided to rebuild one structure in 1953 in order to turn it into a museum dedicated to Tubman's humanitarian vision. You can actually still visit this museum today.
When it comes to Harriet Tubman, there are a number of myths and potential inaccuracies. It is believed that some of these began with Sarah Bradford, Harriet's biographer. We'd like to clear some of these myths up, so in this segment, we are going to talk about them and correct them. As mentioned earlier, Harriet Tubman was one of the most well-known conductors for the Underground Railroad. The first myth we are going to discuss is the myth that she rescued 300 people in 19 trips. The fact is, she rescued around 70 people. and they were often friends or family. The 300 number was estimated by Bradford herself. This inaccuracy amplified Harriet's accomplishments on the Underground Railroad. While 70 is less than 300, it does not take away the work that Tubman did. Either way, she rescued a ton of people and was also a pivotal member of the network, and it is important to get her story right. The next myth is about Tubman's dead or alive $40,000 bounty. As a matter of perspective, John Wilkes Booth was given a bounty of $50,000 for the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. A bounty of $40,000, according to the National Park Service, would be several million today. Truthfully, the only time a reward was set for the capture of her was on October 3, 1849, after her escape. It also included her brothers, Ben and Harry. Their mistress offered $100 for each of them if captured. The $40,000 bounty figure was actually made up by anti-slavery activist Sally Hawley, who wrote a letter to a newspaper arguing for the support of Tubman in pursuit of back pay and pension from the Union Army. If Tubman did have a bounty of $40,000 on her head, it is likely she would have been caught so much sooner. The next fact that I want to debunk is the fact that Tubman sang 2 songs while rescuing slaves. It was listed in her biography written by Sarah Bradford. Bradford had gotten this fact right for the most part. Tubman would sing the songs Go Down Moses and Bound for the Promised Land. Harriet revealed that when she sang these songs, she would change the tempo to indicate safety or danger. However, the much believed inaccuracy of this fact is that she had sung the popular songs Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Wade in the Water, and Follow the Drinking Gourd. These songs would have actually been unknown to Harriet Tubman because they were made after the Civil War. Therefore, even though Tubman did sing 2 songs while rescuing slaves, which songs she actually sang are often misbelieved to be something else.
Often in history lessons, it's taught that Harriet Tubman was illiterate as she could not read and write. Yes, she could not read. However, it is totally untrue to say that she was completely illiterate just because she was literate in other ways that, in my opinion, mattered so much more, especially for her situation, and it also ultimately aided in her survival. It's interesting that schools will gloss over this fact because, again, in my opinion, they should be teaching that literacy does not have to be limited to only books, but can also be found in many areas. And again, I think they should be telling the whole truth rather than just picking and choosing for whatever fits their narrative or curriculum. Because honestly, it is important and children should know this information. I just don't understand why they wouldn't be taught this because I believe this information, one, I think is age appropriate, and I also think it exposes children to new ways of thinking as well as just lets them know that strengths can come from many areas. However, I digress. Harriet was still incredibly intelligent and meticulous about things despite not being able to read, and more people should know about this. I will now be going into detail of the things that she knew a lot about. For the first example, and this fact is actually probably the most well known, she knew how to read constellations, and she knew which stars to keep a lookout for to guide her to the north. As a child, at least I learned that she used the constellation the Big Dipper, or it's also referred to as the Drinking Gourd. These sets of stars are the 7 stars in Ursa Major that form what resemble a pot or a drinking gourd. Most importantly, however, she used the North Star, which was the biggest and brightest star, also called Polaris. It was impressive that she knew this because she essentially taught herself this, and she knew there was a correlation with the stars and the cardinal directions. She was practically an expert of navigation and would use her knowledge of geography and the stars and taught many people the same. Because of her amazing sense of direction, she freed so many people, and again, this is thanks to her, and she knew this without having to open a book at all. So another example is that she was literate in geography. She knew exactly where she needed to go. She could identify different places just from landscaping and geography. She knew how to read through water streams and rivers. She knew where she was based on woods and fields, which again was completely self-taught. It is clear that she was fully capable, especially for the sake of her own self-preservation. She needed to know these things in order to survive, and it was clear that she had the mental capacity and was just generally smart enough to identify these things. Another way she was literate was that she was able to read people and situations. She knew exactly what to say, when to say it, how to say it, and which people to say it to. She would often present herself as a different type of person, through her disguises as a way to deceive others to get what she wanted. In this case, usually it was for the sake of freedom. So yes, Harriet may not have been literate in the sense that she could read books. However, she was emotionally intelligent and was incredibly knowledgeable of the world. She was self-sufficient and also selfless, which I think are very important traits for a natural leader just like her. So the final and probably the most famous myth that a lot of people don't even know about is the fact that Harriet Tubman actually did not use the quilt code. If you don't know, the quilt code is said to be a method of communication regarding how to escape slavery via patterns on quilts hung up around the Underground Railroad. So this would be safe houses, holding up quilts as a way to like signify that they were safe and also where they needed to go. However, the use of quilt codes at all are said to be a myth themselves. Instead, Harriet Tubman used other various methods to escape slavery and free others. She pretty much only relied on people she trusted to hide her, used disguises, followed rivers, and she would use songs to indicate either danger or safety, and pretty much a lot more than just quilts. Now, even if those myths typically mean well or stretch the truth to make Harriet appear in a certain light, ultimately I think it's important to tell her real truths because, in my opinion, it honors Harriet the proper way, it honors her story the proper way, and people should be aware of what happened as opposed to exaggerated details because what Harriet truly did was beyond impressive and just shows what an extraordinary human being she was. Now, after everything we've discussed, all the information we've provided, and all the facts we've disclosed, it is safe to say that Harriet Tubman indeed was a badass woman. One can argue that she's the badass woman. Being born into slavery, forced to work at age 5, and having to be separated from her family pretty much all her life, this only scratches the surface of Harriet's childhood.
It was amazing that she was still able to find the courage to run away and not only become a free woman herself, but to help over 70 people into freedom. Even with everything she's been through and was going through at the time, she was still able to organize her escapes on top of having to stay focused from the pressure of being caught. Again, one wrong move or even just a shred of fear or hesitance was out of the question, as they could have jeopardized the whole journey. Harriet was determined to make sure every person she brought to freedom would be able to do so alive without any complications. If that does not show what an incredible leader she was, then I don't know what does. Not only that, but she was also a spy during the war, something that could have gotten her killed if she was ever found out. This also shows just how brave she was and the lengths she went through for the cause. She risked her life for so many people, and also her actions in the movement and war show just how important freedom and free will were to her in a corrupted world.
We believe she is an incredible, if not the best example of liberty in American history. Harriet Tubman's legacy is still important today because she shows girls what it means to be a strong woman. She fought against injustice, freed slaves, led an armed military raid, healed soldiers, and so much more. She was an ultimate badass woman. Today, we can still reflect on her story and find ways to incorporate it into our daily lives.
Thank you everyone for listening to today's podcast episode.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed it.